afternoon. Brian Gilmore, Associate Professor at Michigan State University College of Law. And I'm a graduate of this law school, class of 1992. I was very happy to be back. I'm a graduate of the law school in 1992. And it's always good to be back here in Washington, D.C. because I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. and this is where I became an attorney. And I'm not the moderator for the panel. This is a different kind of panel. We just get up and start talking. It doesn't matter to me at all. I'm just very happy to see a nice turnout. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my paper. I'm going to, I'll start by talking a little bit about my experience in D.C. with kind of the topic of my paper, and then I'll read a section of my paper, and then I'll be followed by the other panelists. The name of my paper is called Again and Again We Suffer, the Poor and the Endurance of the War on Drugs. And I became a staff attorney at the Neighborhood Legal Services Program in 1993 in the Southeast office in Anacostia, east of the river. We represented a lot of people in public housing, a lot of poor tenants in the city, a lot of low-income families and individuals. And that's kind of like my experience with the topic, because that was also right around the same time that Bill Clinton came to office. And probably the two things that sort of pushed the policy of the way public housing, that's kind of like the focus of my paper, because and you'll see what when we get talking about it. Bill Clinton is kind of like the person who's sort of most influential on policy dealing with public housing and drug testing and drug treatment, where drugs are treated in public housing, because he's responsible for not only the one-strike policy, but he's also included in the welfare to work legislation. There's strong language about the way drugs will be treated amongst the poor, people who receive government benefits. And those two things are the things that are the impetus for the policy that got implemented, the way it gets treated in public housing. People get thrown out for one strike, one mistake with drugs and things like that. That's kind of like and that's kind of like my experience. That is my experience, because we would repeatedly have to assist people who were facing termination of their benefits because of a violation of the policy, or the alleged violation of policy, or violation of policy by one of their family members, something to that effect, and they would lose their subsidy, their housing subsidy in public housing. And the really bad thing about it was, we were willing to fight the case, but they didn't even they would also lose their rights, their administrative rights, to fight the case within the administrative process. The case would go right to court, and they would have to fight the case in court, as opposed to other violations which didn't skip over that step. And that was one of the main things I confronted here in the kind of cases we did while I was staff attorney at the Neighborhood Legal Services Program. I also worked in the Northwest office for 2 years. I worked in the Southeast office for 5 years. And I worked at the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless for several years. And in all those agencies, we confronted that same kind of dilemma with individuals being put out or losing their subsidy because of the way drugs were being treated. Mainly the one-strike policy was the big issue. And then when welfare to work was passed in 1996, it became a concerted effort to kind of put that also on women who were receiving government benefits. Their benefits would be under threat because of their alleged entanglement with illegal narcotics. And that was sort of like the first stage of that. But then the second stage of that was when the public housing sort of shifted, and they began building like the Hope 6 program. They began building the new facilities where people would be able to get housing. And they began tearing down the old public houses from the 40s and 50s. They began tearing those down. And individuals in the old housing were told they could come back and get the new housing in these new townhomes that you probably see all over town. But lo and behold, when a lot of them would come back, they wouldn't be able to get back in because they would use the drug policy to keep them out. And say one of your relatives has a drug conviction linked to drugs, and they wouldn't be able to get back in. And the return rate was very low. And those two events were the two events I experienced as a staff attorney, and it was very frustrating. It was mainly frustrating because of the nature of it, the one strike. I think it was very significant in that regard. And also the loss of the ability to, on the administrative side, the loss of the ability to fight the process within the agency. You would automatically be subject to an eviction, and you'd have to fight the matter in court, which was the most frustrating thing of all for us as attorneys. And that went on most of the time I was here before I moved on to different kind of work, still in the housing field, still representing mostly low-income people. But so I wrote a paper that sort of wanted to address that, but it sort of came up when the Flint Housing Commission of Michigan, if anybody knows the city of Flint, it's near, it's called the City of Cars, it's in Michigan, and it's just, I was just telling Professor Britton that people should go out there to Michigan, see Flint, Michigan, and Detroit. They would be appalled at what has happened to these two great cities because the car industry moved on to somewhere else, went offshore, so to speak, and these cities have been left behind. I know everybody heard about the statistics from Detroit, and I don't live that far from Detroit now, and it's very true. I mean, it's unreal when you see high-rises that are boarded up. I mean, high-rise, whole block, city blocks boarded up. It's unreal from when I first went to Detroit back in the day, so to speak, to now, where it's like, I don't even recognize it anymore. So, but this comes out of Flint. My paper was sort of motivated by Flint because Flint, Michigan Housing Commission decided to proposed to drug test all individuals who wanted to be in public housing or in public housing. And it was a proposal that came up last year in March. They announced it, and immediately the ACLU sort of pounced on it and went after them for that threatened lawsuit. So it's still sort of, they haven't said they won't implement it, but I think the threat of litigation has sort of held them off a little bit. So I'm going to read a portion of it, of the section that sort of deals with that. It's in the paper. The section is called "The Law of Drug Testing the Poor," and it sort of also alludes to the Clinton policy. The debate over how to address control of narcotics in the United States became much more intense in the political realm, despite the fact that the policy approach proposed by the politicians in the face of failure had lost its credibility. President Bill Clinton, chief executive who signed welfare reform into law, also is responsible for the one strike policy in public housing that is consistent with the long-failed draconian approach to drug control. Clinton's call for this strict policy on tenancy in public housing and to prevent drug dealers from residing in public housing led to all kinds of exclusionary tactics related to drug prohibition. The policy and the consistent reliance upon this approach centers the war on drugs in the lives of the poor and has resulted in the denial of access to public housing for virtually any crime. The Flint Housing Commission proposal, discussed briefly, is part of this political culture that has emerged. In August 2010, the Flint Housing Commission announced its proposed plan to begin drug testing public housing residents, a proposal the commission had been discussing and considering for months. According to a media account at the time, the test for any resident over the age of 18 would be mandatory, whether the resident was using drugs or not. The ACLU immediately contacted Rodney Slaughter, executive director of the commission, by letter challenging the legality of the proposal and urged reconsideration of implementation of the plan. Michael Steinberg, legal director of the ACLU Michigan chapter, and attorney Gregory T. Gibbs wrote the letter to Slaughter and specifically identified the inherent and obvious problems with the drug testing program by the Flint Commission. The ACLU in its communication to Slaughter described the proposed policy as unconstitutional because it unfairly singles out poor people for privacy violations, and there are more effective means to address drug abuse. The letter adds that the proposed policy feeds into the worst and most unfair stereotypes about poor people. According to Steinberg and Gibbs, the policy assumes people applying for assistance are violating the law and treats them like criminals without basis. The letter also advised Slaughter that drug testing is an ineffective and fiscally irresponsible means to discover drug abuse. In the letter, the ACLU also discussed in great detail a previous dispute handled by the ACLU of Michigan that sought to impose drug testing upon individuals receiving government benefits. It is an extremely important case considering these latest proposals by elected officials for more policies mandating drug testing, specifically on individuals who are receiving government benefits, normally associated with poverty. The case is also important because there are a few cases of this nature available for review in order to consider the serious legal issues. The case the ACLU invoked in its letter is called Liszewski v. Howard and provides considerable guidance with respect to the legality of such drug tests. Liszewski begins with a complaint filed by several recipients of welfare assistance who were subject to drug testing even though there was no reason to believe they were in fact drug users. The women received benefits from Michigan's Family Independence Program, or FIP, a program connected to federal welfare benefits. The requirement that the women, the recipients who sued, could be subjected to random drug testing stemmed from the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, signed into law by President Bill Clinton. Among other things, PRWORA authorized but did not mandate states to test TANF recipients for use of controlled substances and to sanction those recipients who test positive. Michigan was the first state to make use of this authority and attempt to implement that section of the law in some manner through the passage of its own law to implement such a program. The women in Liszewski sued to enjoin implementation of a program of suspicionless drug testing on welfare recipients under the program. A temporary restraining order was initially granted by the court in the case, as the case held that drug testing proposed by the program was in fact a suspicionless search and that the state did not meet the standard necessary to be able to engage in a suspicionless search of an individual absent reasonable suspicion. Indeed, the important principle from Liszewski is the Fourth Amendment analysis of the intrusive search without any reason to believe the person is in fact using illegal substances. Quote, historically, the Supreme Court has generally viewed the Fourth Amendment as requiring some quantum of individualized suspicion for a search or seizure to be constitutional. Furthermore, it is universally agreed that the collection and testing of urine is a search within the meaning of the Fourth Amendment, unquote. Due to the fact that the proposed drug testing is deemed a search pursuant to the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the lack of reasonable suspicion in the case presented problems for the state of Michigan in implementing the program for drug testing. The court in Liszewski noted that generally viewed the Fourth Amendment as requiring some quantum of individualized suspicion for a search or seizure to be constitutional. While there are instances where drug testing is allowed, despite the fact there is no evidence that there is some suspicion as to whether the individual is using the drug, it is allowed according to the law expressed in Liszewski under very limited circumstances. Quote, the core issue was whether the drug testing was warranted by a special need. It stated that not only must there be a special need, but if there is one, it must be substantial and important to override the individual's acknowledged privacy interests and sufficiently vital to suppress the Fourth Amendment's normal requirement of individualized suspicion. In Liszewski, the state argued that there was a strong public interest in preventing drug abuse and child neglect amongst Michigan recipients of welfare benefits because of the direct correlation between drug abuse and neglect. This argument failed. The court held that child abuse and neglect were not the reasons for passing the welfare reform law. Indeed, the new welfare reform law was no longer an entitlement program and focused specifically on attempting to remove individuals from the welfare system into employment. In sum, the plaintiffs in Liszewski were able to sustain the request for a preliminary injunction and halt the program as configured because they could and did meet all of the requirements for the injunction. According to the court, the searches, the mandatory drug testing without suspicion made it likely that the recipients would succeed on the merits. In addition, the court held that the searches would result in irreparable harm because they are unconstitutional, that there was little harm to the defendants because the acts they were prohibited from conducting unconstitutional searches And the public interest is certainly served by stopping a government entity from randomly drug testing anyone receiving welfare benefits. While Marshall was reversed and remanded by a federal appeals court, the reversal was vacated as the court voted to grant en banc review that never occurred. The legal effect of this en banc review is that the reversal of the district court's decision is vacated, and the current law is the original decision from the district court. In addition, while there is no explicit order for drug testing in all public housing programs funded by the U.S., the policy pursued against individuals who happen to be poor continues to provide for some surveillance. It is not only welfare reform that provided the government the ability to attempt to drug test individuals, as in the Marchinsky case, but in 1988, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act had already provided momentum for these efforts. The act, among other things, afforded public housing authorities the ability to deny housing assistance to individuals if they, their family member, or guests are engaged in drug activity. This portion of the law is the language that led to drug testing efforts on tenants and then subsequent challenges. The subtle suggestion in the law's agenda is if the agency is seeking to maintain a drug-free community, it can implement some reasonable measures to identify those who are using drugs. How this comports with the Fourth Amendment's prohibition on unreasonable searches is difficult and has still not been resolved. Searches pursued without suspicion fall into this category. Rodney Slaughter, Executive Director of the Flint Housing Commission, stated when he proposed drug testing for public housing residents that if you are receiving government benefits, quote, then you should have the responsibility of showing you are a productive citizen, as well as having responsibility for the home supported by taxpayer dollars, unquote. It is doubtful that Slaughter actually believes this statement. If this were true, many more Americans would be subject to drug testing. We all receive various benefits from the government, and most of us are not subject to drug testing on a random basis to continue to receive that benefit. Slaughter's statement is really about imposing the will of the government upon the poor. The most well-known study that compared drug use amongst the poor to drug use rates of the general population revealed that there was no significant difference in drug use between the poor and the general population. The study, completed in 1996, was released in a period of time when the government decided to shift its policy against the poor to more draconian, inequitable policies. Would any U.S. citizen agree to a drug test for receiving mortgage insurance protection from the Federal Housing Administration or the Veterans Administration? How about if your loan explicitly stated that in order to continue to receive the mortgage insurance protection, you have to agree to random drug tests or mandatory drug tests for the first 5 years of the loan? Would anyone deducting interest from their mortgage on their tax return agree to random drug testing each year they receive that benefit? The ACLU of Michigan, in its letter to Slaughter, actually raised this issue as well. Quote, even in the context of housing, only the poor are forced to submit to tests. In 2009, the mortgage interest deduction was estimated to cost the government $100 billion. This specific tax deduction is the largest government subsidy for housing and one of the most expensive tax deductions. However, no drug tests are required as a condition of receiving the mortgage interest deduction. These questions force a question. Why are subsidies for the poor different from subsidies for the middle class or the working class, who might also be using illegal drugs? This line of inquiry can be expanded once you consider this about government benefits and social conduct. Should individuals in government training programs be tested? How about artists and writers who receive grants from the National Endowment for the Arts? Which government benefit should grant immunity to the recipient from government intervention into their lives to be certain that the benefit isn't subsidizing drug use? Perhaps Governor-elect of Florida, now he's the governor, Rick Scott, in calling for drug testing anyone receiving benefits in his state, answered the question in the same manner. Quote, it's practical and it's fair. We shouldn't be subsidizing people who are doing drugs, Scott noted in 2010. Scott is implying, as Rodney Slaughter of the Flint Housing Commission implied, that the poor are the real problem and not the approach to a social issue that has been around for decades. Aren't we likely subsidizing millions of people in some manner who are using illegal drugs? Neither Slaughter nor Scott ever paused to evaluate as to whether the real problem is the overall approach to drug control. Many others haven't either, at least with respect to government benefits. Various states in the last few years have also introduced legislation that will require drug testing in order to receive government benefits such as food stamps and unemployment benefits. And in closing, the point of the paper is that the subsidy the individuals receive is a government subsidy. It's a government benefit. And the reason why the Liszewski case is very important is because that's what that is, even though that's welfare benefits. But this is a housing subsidy. It's even more important, housing. So it's so important that they would link these two like that. But there's a trend going on, even right now. Now that we've had this big shift politically in the country, across the country, in state legislatures, a big shift. A lot of states have already started trying to put these kind of things in, and on welfare benefits, food stamps, unemployment benefits, and also housing. It seems like housing is one of the most difficult ones, even though the Flint Commission issue is sort of still pending. It seems like housing is one of the more difficult ones for them to implement. But the other ones, it's bills all across the country. I even pulled a few this morning, one from Kentucky, one from Arkansas. These bills are pending. We also discovered, my research assistant also discovered that on tribal lands, that this issue is even larger. That what has happened is HUD has a special program for you to provide housing on tribal lands. They will give you money, you provide the housing, but what you have to do, you have to implement anti-drug programs. And those anti-drug programs are not necessarily treatment. What we found out is those anti-drug programs are testing. Testing, and if you want to live here, you have to be tested. You have to agree to be tested. And we've run into a few instances where people had to agree to the test in their lease to that effect. But it's still a government benefit, and ask the question, should you have to accept that, intrusion on your privacy like that, to receive a government benefit? And in this instance, it's just those benefits that benefit low-income individuals who rely on that. And with so many people now who qualify for food stamps, it's a really huge issue now because a lot of states are saying, if you want food stamps, you got to do the drug testing because you're probably trading your food stamps for drugs. There's no studies proving that that's true, that the poor use more drugs than the normal population. In fact, most studies say that it's not true. There's no evidence of that at all. Even in public housing, there's no truth to this notion that in public housing, more people in public housing use drugs. The problem really with public housing was it became like a nice place to sell drugs because it was an area that was discarded by society. It was over here in the middle of nowhere. Nobody wanted, there's nothing around there. So sure, these where people wanted to sell drugs. It wasn't the individuals in the building necessarily all using drugs. That's not true. There's no evidence of that either. But that's all that's been used. Even Rehnquist, in the famous Rucker case, used that in the Rucker case to say like, oh, these projects are full of drug dealers, that kind of thing. It wasn't necessarily, nobody didn't know if they were full of drug dealers, but drug dealers certainly liked those areas because they were discarded areas from society. They were isolated areas, good place to sell drugs, and everybody came around there to buy drugs. It's not the people who were living there. So that's kind of like the thrust of my paper. At the end, it talks about things that lawyers can do. That's what we're sort of here for. I mean, I think where I am right now, we're sort of looking at the tribal land issue, and we think that these take a look at it, these things might be able to be challenged. I mean, for somebody to have to agree to a mandatory drug test, I mean, intrusion upon their privacy like that, they don't really want to, but if you want the housing, you have to do it. Maybe they don't want to do it. Maybe they feel marked why they have to do that. But I mean, if you're a lawyer, you have to think about maybe challenging these kind of things. In DC, I don't think they have such a policy as DCHA. And the final point is, people should know that this has happened, the drug testing and how public housing would be sort of weird anyway, because there's been a huge shift away from the way public housing used to be. Now that it's They're trying to move people out into the community. The benefit is at a different location. So how would you feel if you were like one of 10 people who were like in some complex and everybody else, and you're the ones who had to get drug tested because you're getting substance? That would be, that's, I don't think anybody would like that. So that's kind of like the crux of my paper. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ken Lammers. I'm a Deputy Commonwealth Attorney in Wise County in Virginia. And for those of you who have no clue where Wise County, Virginia, welcome, or join the rest of the world. Nobody else knows where it is either. We are in the part of Virginia that's west of West Virginia. So, pretty isolated out there. In the middle of the Appalachian Mountains, and they were real clear to me that I was to pronounce it Appalachian when I got here to tell y'all how to pronounce it right. So, it's Appalachian. Our big problem out there is pills, legal drugs that are being abused. And tell you right here, here's what we got. Now, well, let me tell you where I started from. Before I went out there, for about 5 years, 6 years, I was a defense attorney in the Richmond, Virginia area. Specifically Chesterfield, which is between Richmond and Petersburg. And I'd handled all sorts of drug cases: cocaine, marijuana, heroin, psilocybin, ketamine, you know, kind of name it, I'd handled it, I thought. And, you know, when I moved out and took a job as an assistant Commonwealth attorney out in Wise County, I thought, well, I'm going to go out here and I'm going to know more than these folks out in the mountains about anything, drugs. And I got out there, and I was the most lost group you ever saw in your life. They're all talking about oxys, perks, Z's, tabs, you know, Roxys, Oxy 80s, Oxy 40s. I'm like, what in the world are you people talking about? And this is up here on the screen right here to show you these are our top 5 abused drugs in my area. I checked on this with the lady in charge of all our drug prosecution before I came here to make sure. OxyContin, Roxicodone, and Percocet, the one across the top, they're all pain pills. And opioids, to be more specific. OxyContin and Roxicodone they're sold under those names. They're actually, Oxycodone is the generic name of it. OxyContin is time release, Roxicodone is not, it's instant release, so OxyContin comes in higher dosages. That, what you're seeing up there, the bottom 3 of that OxyContin are 40, 80 milligrams, and 160 milligrams. They sell for $1 a milligram on the street, so if you get an Oxy 80 milligram Oxy for $4 a pill, is what they cost at the pharmacy, or if you've got Medicaid, Medicare, or what other insurance, you may pay 50 cents to $1 a pill. You can make the rest of that $80 for every pill you sell, and they sell them, let me tell you. Now, I've never seen an Oxy 160. I pretty much figure that anybody who snorts an Oxy 160 is not going to wake up the next morning, so that's why we haven't had problems with that so much, I don't think. Roxicodone, like I say, it's the instant release. It only goes up, or I think it only goes up to 30 milligrams. The feds made, the company that makes that, stop selling 5 milligram versions because they never told them they could. And I think it was probably too popular. And then what we got over here, Percocet is one of any number of what's called hydrocodone. These are pills that, they're opioids as well. They are pills that Lortabs, Vicodin, Roxicet, all these things. It's a mixture of oxycodone, to be simplistic about it, a mixture of oxycodone and acetaminophen. These are dangerous not only in the fact that they cause people to get high, respiratory failure, etc. The acetaminophen causes, I may be saying right, acetaminophen causes damages to the breathing system, pulmonary system, causes liver failure, etc. I mean, and these are our highest. These are the ones that we see on the market the most. Percocet. They sell a lot cheaper than the oxycodones do. Down here at the bottom, Subutex, there's also Suboxone. That's buprenorphine. This was supposed to be the wonder drug that was going to cure all opioid dependency. This was not supposed to be addictive. It was not supposed to be something that you could get high off of. It's supposed to be better than methadone because, you know, now most well-run methadone clinics give the person a liquid rather than pills to take home because it's so highly addictive, but and can be sold. Suboxone or buprenorphine, Subutex, and that was supposed to be something they could take home and use. It's something that's generally put under the tongue. It's supposed to block opioid receptors, and you can't get high off of it. Well, sure, shooting as soon as people started taking it home, they figured out ways to get high off of it by mixing it with other things. We also see a thriving trade in this, in that somebody is hooked on oxys or roxys, and they can't get that this week. They will find somebody to buy at a far cheaper rate some Subutex or Suboxone so that they don't crash, so that they can make it through until they get enough money or can find some more pills. Down here in the bottom right, Xanax, and I think we've probably all heard of Xanax. It's a nerve pill. It's meant for mental issues, anxiety. It's alprazolam. It's the only one that's not an opioid on there. It's actually benzodiazepine, benzo. And these are our 5 worst. And they're all over the place out there. And when I first got out there, I figured, okay, what's going on is cocaine and heroin hasn't gotten here. We haven't seen any of that stuff out here, so the pills just kind of moved in and took the place that cocaine and heroin was. And I spoke to an attorney who'd been around there for a while, and he kind of smiled at me and looked at me like I was, you know, charmingly naive and said, you don't get it. Cocaine was everywhere out here. Every holler, every street you could get it. And then the pills came, and the cocaine was gone. It cannot compete with the pills. Heroin is also down. And I will say that's fairly true. In 5 years now I've been out there, I think I've seen 3 cocaine cases, you know, as opposed to, you know, I myself would represent 3 or 4 people a day that had cocaine charges when I was around Richmond. So I think I've seen 3. That's not to say that that's all there were, but it's the only ones that come to mind. The other thing that really struck me in the beginning of this was I got out there and looked around and it was like, oh my God, everybody's dying. And they were. It was something else. I mean, I've been doing, like I said, in Richmond, dealing with all these people. You get like 1 or 2 persons every 6 months that wouldn't show up to court who died because they'd overdosed or for other reasons. And out there, it was like every week, somebody was missing court because they were dead. And I can remember a couple of weeks where it was 2 or 3 people missing court because they were dead. And I'm not talking about, you know, the kind of court you probably see here in DC, or you used to see around Richmond, where, you know, you'd have 200 people waiting for their day in court. We're talking about a court where there's like 40 people, well, let's say more like 20 to 40 people doing court that day. And so we had a high death rate. And everybody talks about how terrible it is where they are. Next slide, please. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. The ME, medical examiner in Virginia, keeps records of what people died from. And between 2003 and 2008, they list every county and the per capita death rate in that county from overdoses. 2003 to 2008, the ones with the highest death rates for that year are marked there by the number. 2003 was Craig County, that's that little purple county. 2004 is Lee County, it's the last county in Virginia. 2005 is Pulaski, that's the green one over there. Towards, 2006 is Wise and the city of Norton, that's where I practice at, where I'm a prosecutor at. 2007, 2008 was Dickinson County, that red county right above Wise. And if you look at it again, of the top 5 deaths, per capita death rates of those 6 years, Dickinson County, which is the top red one, was on that list 5 years. County below that, Russell County, was on that list 5 years. Wise County, City of Norton, where I'm at, was on that list 4 years. Lee County was on it 3. You can see that's all up through the mountains there. Highest per capita death rates, and that's pills, folks. We don't really have much anything else going on. But that's the pills, and they're dying from the left and right. And to put it in perspective for y'all, next slide, please. I recall this morning, Mr. Sterling showed you that in 2007, the national death rate was up to 7 per 100,000. Now, I heard a lot before I came out of here about how terrible things are in D.C., read things in newspaper articles, kind of some of the papers that came with this. And you're right, D.C. is twice the rate of the rest of the country. Counties out there, 2 to 3 times the amount of D.C.'s death rate. So, you know, for instance, 2007, D.C.'s death rate was 16 per 100,000. Dickens County 62, Wise County 60, Lee 17. You notice that only one of these counties, and these counties are the ones that are right along the border with Kentucky, I just chose them because they're right lined up with each other. One of these counties, Lee County, in 2008 is the only year that any of them have a lower death rate than Washington, D.C. And we have high death rates with this stuff, folks. And so the question goes, how did we get there? And last Friday I was having lunch with a number of defense attorneys that are buddies of mine. And for those of you that are going into criminal law, you don't necessarily have to hate the guy on the other side. You just have to beat him, okay? If you can. And I asked them, you know, what would you say is the problem? What should I tell people out there about this? And they're saying, tell them about the doctors. We can't shut the doctors down. The doctors are turning into pushers. They won't stop. They won't admit what they're doing. You know, and I don't know that that's 100% fair. As a matter of fact, I don't think that's 100% fair. I think at one time, a lot of doctors were really kind of naive about it. And we do still have some naivete and greed, large portion greed, that keeps some doctors doing it. But there are actually 3 parties that led to the high amount of problems we have with these prescription drugs. One's the pharmaceutical companies who are just putting this stuff out in job lots, way more than they can legitimately say, oh yeah, we know that's going to go for legal use. Second is the doctors, and they are the gatekeepers, so they do, you know, it has to go through them. And third's the insurance companies. Now the insurance companies aren't really interested in pushing the pills, but they just kind of got caught into it because they covered how much the pills cost. So what you get is, well, let me go through the most famous case that's out there. Next slide. Purdue Pharma produces OxyContin. OxyContin is oxycodone. I think they started this in mid-90s. They started producing this. They sent out people, salespeople, set up seminars for doctors, start telling doctors, look, it's not going to be addictive. They're not going to build a resistance to this because it's all time release. It's going to cure every pain you've ever seen in your life. Short-term, long-term, repetitive, breakthrough, any kind of pain. And, you know, the doctors, and what they don't tell the doctors is, and it's basically synthetic heroin. Okay? They just kind of don't push that part. Doctors take it back, and in places like where I'm at, you know, in the mountains, there are 2 types of jobs that pay well. One's in the coal mines, the other's lumbering. As you can imagine, people get repetitive pain, they get short-term accidental pain, long-term, there's all sorts of pain that they're dealing with. So, the doctors just start writing the script out for everything. Script means prescription. Script, they write the script out for everything. And everybody's got, all of a sudden, OxyContin. Well, the next step, of course, you know, they've written you the script, you go to the pharmacy, you walk in the door, you got to pay for the pills, and the pills will cost you anywhere $4 to $6 a pill for OxyContin. And, you know, a lot of times the insurance, well, most of the times, the insurance company covers it, so you end up paying like $10 a pill, right? Or not $10 a pill, $10 a bottle, right? So you get it real cheap. It gets everywhere. And, like I said, basically it's synthetic heroin. And used as it's supposed to be used, it can be addictive, but it's not as bad as when it's abused. Now, what we ran into first, well, I think this is the way it kind of developed, is that first, chewing. If you chew it, you'll get high. If you chew and swallow it, you get high. Then people figured out if you snort it, you know, like a line of cocaine, if you snort this stuff, you get higher faster. Okay? Then they figure out that if you liquefy it and inject it, you get even higher, even faster. So it's everywhere, and all of a sudden, everybody's using it. Now, and it's signaled out Purdue Pharma here, but it's, you know, all sorts of pills follow the same track. Purdue Pharma eventually gets hit by the federal government with the federal government in West Virginia finds it costs, I think, somewhere in about a $700 billion settlement with the federal government, which, depending on which sources you believe on how much money Purdue Pharma is making off of OxyContin, I've seen sources that say they make $1 billion a year. I've seen sources that say that up to the point where they got that fine, they've made $1.2 billion, and they just keep chugging along. And Purdue Pharma has, since that time, done some things to try to mitigate. They're trying to put out a new type of pill now, other things. But, of course, other companies have stepped in. Roxycontin, oxycodone has gotten real popular because OxyContin's got harder to find. And, you know, the doctors, they back up. They back off some. You know, like I said, there's some doctors that, out of greed or naivete, just keep handing stuff out. But a good portion of the doctors back off. They're like, well, this stuff's highly addictive. You know, we're just not going to hand it out. I mean, we got people shopping doctors left and right for elective surgery or to have a tooth at a time pulled so they can get pills. And I know that sounds silly, but it actually happens. So the doctors pull back, and there's only so many locally that are willing to do this. So maybe the problems can be controlled. Well, at that point, we start getting online pharmacies. Next one. And I think every one of us has probably gotten spam with this on it, or something similar. I got this one 3 times in the last week, right? Each time went to a different site. And the online pharmacies start handing, you know, they arrange for you to get a script. You log on, and they may send you to a local doctor, or a lot of times they'll have a doctor on site who you write in, I stubbed my toe, I've got turf toe, terrible pain, it's awful. And that doctor on site writes out a prescription, and they then send you 2-day UPS, OxyContin, Vicodin, Percocet. I'm here to tell you, we have the most paranoid UPS deliverers in the world where I live, because people will chase them down rather than waiting until their pills get to their house. We had a case, I don't know, a year ago or so, where some guy, the UPS driver was sitting on the side of the road doing his paperwork. Some guy found out where he was, drove over, and just started screaming at him because he wasn't delivering. He was supposed to deliver those pills. Deputies got involved in that one. So the online pharmacies are there, but you know the thing about the online pharmacies, you have to wait 2 or 3 days for delivery. Well, that's just not fast enough. The next thing we get is pain management clinics. And the king of the pain management clinics is Florida. Next one. As you see here, in 2010, there were 942 pain management clinics in Florida. These 2 counties here alone, Palm Beach and Broward, Broward's the yellow, Palm Beach the orange, are responsible for a huge portion of the pills that make up where we're at in the mountains. Palm Beach had 122 pain clinics in 2010. They passed an ordinance trying to stop more pain clinics from being built. Who knows if it works. And then you got Broward, which went from 4 in 2007, which were probably legitimate. There are legitimate pain clinics out there. You know, you have a hard time selling me that one of them's legitimate if they're not associated with a hospital, but there are legitimate pain clinics out there. Between 2007 and 2010, it went from 4 to 154. And that's the middle of 2010. You know where it's at now. The way this works is, well, next slide. You see here, this is a street in Florida somewhere. I don't know exactly what this is. You see there's 3 doctors on this street, right? First doctor here has got a pharmacist in his doctor's office. He advertises $4 medications. That means he's advertising OxyContin, folks. That's what he's advertising there. $4 medication. People will drive from West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, all over the place and come down to these pain clinics. As a matter of fact, there is a flight from West Virginia to somewhere in this area that is so often used by people who are going to get pills that they call it the Oxy Express. Okay, it's a commuter flight back and forth every day. They go down and they hit this first doctor here, and they go in and they go, hey, you know, doctor, I've got this pain in my back, it's terrible. And the doctor writes them a prescription for a month, 2 months, 3 months worth of OxyContin. And, you know, lo and behold, they've got the pharmacy in the office, so well, actually, most of them aren't even seen by the doctor. They're seen by some sort of nurse practitioner or something like that. They just, you know, you just write your script, They walk the next door over and they get themselves their 3-month supply. Then they go down here where it says walk-ins yes there, that's another doctor, and that walk-ins advertisement means he's willing to take people from out of state. So they walk in there, same thing. Doctor, I got a terrible pain in my back, stuff in my toe, whatever. And that doctor, or his nurse, writes them 2-3 months worth of prescriptions. And there's that blue sign there, is just a guy who just says the pain management phase. He doesn't put all the fancy advertising. I'm pretty sure he gets a fair amount of traffic too. And that's all on one street. And you know, I haven't gone down to Florida to check it out. This is the way, if you live in the mountains and are dealing with this is the way you envision Florida. And, you know, it sounds weird, but I mean, I've listened to drug buy tapes where the guy's sitting there going, look man, I haven't got any oxys today, but Tuesday next week, I'm going to drive down to Florida, and I'll be back Wednesday with 600 or 700 pills. Come see me then. And it goes on all the time. And these aren't people who are living rich either, folks. I mean, they're dealing with thousands of dollars worth of pills. The last prescription I saw from Florida, the guy had gotten $1,800 worth of pills, and over 1,000 of them were OxyContin. I saw it about 2 weeks ago. You know, they go down and they come back up, and they're living in trailers and really beat up homes and stuff. They're not making, and they got a ton of money, but I don't know what they're spending it on other than going and buying more pills. So this is the problem we've got. And to be honest with you, I think this may be kind of the next wave. You know, if you study how drugs happen, they hit in waves. You know, cocaine and heroin hit in a wave. Now we're getting the pills hitting in a wave. You can go back and see other things. There have been other times where pills have been much more of a problem. The problem out here in Florida is that they don't have a prescription drug management program, and that's a fancy way of saying they don't have a database for doctors and pharmacists to report that, you know, John Smith came in and got 30 Percocets today. So you can go from doctor to doctor to doctor. And that's been a huge problem. I mean, Florida itself has had a huge problem with lots of deaths from pain pills because of this thing. People just keep going and get more until they die. So it looked like Florida was going to shake itself up last year. They had passed some laws saying you can't have a pharmacist in the doctor's office, you've got to be outside the doctor's office. Some other type of laws that are kind of more window dressing than anything else. I think they passed laws saying you can't say $4 OxyContin, which is probably why this says $4 medication. You know, they passed some advertising laws and stuff like that. And the big law they passed was they were going to have a prescription drug management program, which means that, you know, if Doctor 1 gives you 30 OxyContin, and you go to Doctor 2 and Doctor 1's put it in the computer, you ain't going to be able to get pills from him. At least that's the theory. They passed it, but they didn't fund it. And their legislature, you know, this is a good idea, but we're just not going to put any money into it. So the people they put in charge of it then went out and found the funding, got enough money to put it together, and now the governor is doing everything in his power to kill it. Changed governors, Rick Scott has tried to kill it, claimed it's supposed to be privacy issues, he's worried about privacy. There's some other silly stuff he said, but privacy is the only one that's got any kind of real teeth to it. And I've never seen anybody say it out loud or anything, or say it directly, but if you read through a lot of newspaper articles, they basically all but accuse him of being owned by the medical industry, which stands to lose a lot of money if this gets shut down. So this is the problem we got. You know, who knows? Oh yeah, and he also turned down Purdue Pharma, trying to get good publicity from the counter what it's had previously. Tried to donate $1 million to their prescription drug management program, which would have run it for 2 years at least, probably more into the three to four. And he turned them down flat. Refused to allow the money, private money, to go into this program. This is an ongoing thing. I mean, this program is already legislatively mandated, but like I say, he's trying to kill it. So, you know what? Kind of the question is, where do we go from here? This is something that's not spread so much. You don't hear about it in a lot of big cities yet. Now, from the mountains, it's spread westward, you know, Louisville, Cincinnati, you're hearing about it. Eastward, it's spread, you hear about it significantly in Boston. But like DC, you don't hear about it all that much. much. You know, you don't hear about it in Richmond, Virginia, that sort of thing. I suspect that it's there around the edges, that law enforcement really has a hard time seeing that this is happening and reporting. It's real hard when you've got a doctor that's handing out prescriptions to arrest that guy and put him in jail for that. Even if he's putting out a whole bunch of them, he can just say, well, that's the way I treat people. I believe that this treatment system is what's going to work. So it becomes difficult to really close these things down at times. You know, as far as it goes out where we're at trying to deal with it, I mean, like I say, we're flooded with it. And you know, I work for an elected official, and the sheriff's an elected official, and when people start saying, what are you going to do about this? Well, we're going to step up and do what the law tells us to do. The sheriff's going to arrest people he catches dealing it. We're going to prosecute people that are dealing it, and that's what's happening. We also have tried things like drug court. We're trying to get a drug court going for those whom we think we can help and get off of these things. You know, because a lot of people, at least initially, get hooked in without intending to. So we're trying to get people, we're trying that as best we can. Of course, the problem is, as it always is, when a prosecutor gets a case, most of the time things are already broken. By the time prosecutors get it, it's often way too late to really accomplish much except go, you know, okay, you're going to jail for 2 years, you know, and that happens. Typically in Virginia, in your first time you're caught dealing anything at Schedule 2, you get at least 7 months. You know, it's not in the federal system where you end up, you know, spending the rest of your life in prison, but you get 7 months. We don't really have a whole lot of simple possession cases because, well, they're regular pills. It's hard to make those cases. This is something that really, our jurisdiction ends at our county line. We can't get these doctors that are handing this out down in Florida, left and right, you know. It's something that the federal system has to handle, really, and they step on occasionally. You occasionally see them prosecuting a doctor who has just gone totally out of control. A lot of Medicare or Medicaid fraud cases come out of that, but they have gone as far as charging doctors with felony murder. I don't know if anyone's actually been convicted of a felony murder charge, but they've charged them. I think most of the time it ends up going down to reckless homicide, and they still get a ton of time in jail, or prison, federal prison. I don't have a solution to this, to be honest with you. I hate the analogy of war on drugs because this is a policing effort. It's been going on forever. 1875, when the first anti-drug law was passed in Virginia. You can go back, and the furthest back I can trace anti-drug laws in history is the 7th century. The Quran outlaws alcohol. They were probably further before then, and they were probably, you know, local potentates and that were making things illegal. It's been going on. It'll continue to go on. And I know that Mr. Sterling said that this really isn't a good excuse, but it's a matter of trying to limit it rather than you can't stop it. You're never going to stop it. We can put the guy in trailer 1 in jail or apartment 1 in jail. Apartment 2, who's just had his supply cut off and knows that if he drives down to Florida on a one-day trip, can come back with something that he can make thousands of dollars off of. Well, apartment 2 is probably going to step up and fill that slot. The nightmare for us is that there's something that's even worse than the pills that are out there now called Opana. And this is oxymorphone. Oxymorphone, there was a pill back in the 70s, I think it was, that they brought oxymorphone out for a while, and it was abused so badly it got taken off the market. It is basically, you know, when somebody's in a hospital and they're about to die and they'd be screaming in pain if they weren't getting a morphine drip, that's what we're talking about. And they're starting to put that out as a pill called Opana. We're starting to see it. If you look online, to the sites where people who use these drugs and abuse them, they get online on places like Topics and Blue Light and stuff, and they compare how you can do this and that with the drugs and how good the high is. They tell you that it's 4 to 5 times better than heroin. You know, that it's basically the one drug that's going to kill everything out if it gets there. The one thing that seems to be keeping it from really spreading hard is that is ethnic lines, to be honest with you. This is a white person's drug, white person's game primarily. You know, which is kind of silly. I mean, it's like anybody who's dealt with crack, you know, people who had problems with crack, you've seen a number of black people who are African Americans that have had crack cocaine problems, but you've also seen some whites. But by and large, it seemed to be a black community issue thing, and I think probably most of my defendants that were having issues with crack cocaine were probably African American. This is the same way; it's just flipped. You know, this is seen as something that, well, they call the people who use it, at least out where I'm at, pillbillies. You know, it is something that is permeating the white underclass, the white social underclass, and doesn't seem to be getting across that firewall into, you know, African American and Mexican poor. Now, I can't speak so much for what's happening out west. I know they're having pill problems out west as well. Those, however, seem to be coming primarily up from Mexico, not from Florida, like all ours. And, you know, there may be a different dispersion out there. But if it ever does jump that firewall, I think this, like I've already said, it drives cocaine out of the market really quickly. It is as addictive as heroin, or worse. And, you know, some of the effects that have been seen in places like Boston where it's shown up is that those people who are dealing heroin stop cutting it. They start making it more pure. They start making it better product and selling it cheaper so they don't get driven out of the market by the pills. But I don't have a nice way to wrap this up. I'm just kind of showing you what the situation is, and I'll leave it there. We're going to questions after everybody's finished, sir.
I want to thank Ken for the great background. I have some of the solutions, so my name is Mike Liszewski. I'm a 3L here at UDC Law. I'm also on the board of directors for Students for Sensible Drug Policy. This conference is pretty unique in the sense we've got 3 board of director members here. Eric Sterling's on the board of directors, Alex Cright is on the board of directors, and we are also graced with the presence of Irene Alexander, who's the director of our board.
So it's 4.
Right. I meant speaking, but thank you for the math correction. I'm not going to be talking about medical marijuana, but just as a brief way of introduction, I wanted to mention that marijuana is in fact a gateway drug. Before I came to law school, I was furious at the Barr Amendment. The Barr Amendment is what prevented DC from implementing our medical marijuana law, which we passed with nearly 7% of the vote in 1998. That fury is what drove me to become a law student, and so medical marijuana, or marijuana as it is a gateway drug to a legal education. One of the co-founders of our law school, Edgar Kahn, wrote a book entitled No More Throwaway People. The book is about different subject matter than what I'm about to speak about, but I think it frames what I'm talking about very well. Talking about overdose and overdose victims. When supporters of the war on drugs speak of the necessity for it, they often say things like, we got to think of the children, and we're going to be sending the wrong message. Apparently, this message that we want to send is, if you witness an overdose, or if you suffer an overdose, you have 2.5 options. You can call for help and hope you get a good-hearted prosecutor. I think we have one here. You can watch your friends suffer and perhaps die. Or you can stick a 20 in their pocket, dump them in front of an ER, and hope for the best. And that often ends in an arrest as well. To combat this problem, 2 states and nearly 100 colleges and universities have implemented a response. This response protects the victims of drug overdose. It protects the people who call for help in these situations. It prevents them from being prosecuted. This sort of protection is known as Good Samaritan overdose immunity. I'm going to talk initially, I'm going to offer a brief real-life example. Hopefully they're not responding to overdose. Then I'm going to provide some background information on overdose and the problem that we suffer in this nation from this overwhelming problem. Now I'm going to go through the development of Good Samaritan laws, Good Samaritan policies, beginning at the college level, and then we now have 2 states that have implemented laws. We had 2 others that came really close last year, and a handful of others that are still considering them. They're in committee and they're bubbling up. All right, so I'm going to read this story. It comes out of the Daily News from Columbia, Washington. A 911 call for heroin overdose early Thursday morning led to the arrest of a Kelso man for investigation of possessing drugs with the intent to sell them. The overdose victim, a 29-year-old Kelso woman who was also 6 months pregnant, was revived by paramedics and taken to St. John's Medical Center. Kelso police said. Dispatchers took the 911 call at 1:49 a.m. from a residence. Blah, blah, blah. Officers arrested Hancock. He was the man with possession of the drugs, on suspicion of driving with a suspended license when he returned to the scene. Hancock claimed he saved the woman's life by telling someone to call 911 before he left. Hancock was arrested for having a meth pipe in his pocket. He had 6.1 grams of meth, 2 grams of heroin, and 3.7 grams of marijuana. Hancock claimed that these were the amounts of drugs he needed just to get started. That's his story. He was booked on suspicion of possessing of methamphetamine with intent to deliver, and as well with the heroin. He was set on $20,000 bond, and the police forwarded the case to the prosecutor's office. This happened back in December of this year. Not exactly sure where it's going right now, but keep this story in mind as I go on with the discussion here on this topic. When someone asks the question, why are drugs illegal, which is really another way of saying, why do we have a war on drugs? Again, these answers come from places of we need to protect the children and we need to send the right message. This policy has placed us in a position where overdose deaths have overtaken deaths from motor vehicle accidents. In 2005, we had 22,448 overdose deaths. Compare that to homicides, that's only about 17,000 a year. The increase in overdose deaths has happened over about a 3-decade period. Between 1980 and 1999, there was a 400% increase in overdose. Between 1999 and 2005, it increased another full 100%. So in just 2.5 decades, we had about an 8-fold increase in the number of overdose deaths in this country. Something that should be noted, 1980, when this increase really first started, that is when Phase 3 of the war on drugs kicked into action. I like to think of Phase 1 being Harry Anslinger when he began in the 1930s, Richard Nixon Stage 2, and Ronald Reagan Stage 3. So we are in the middle of Stage 3 of the drug war. Hopefully it's drawing to a close. The problem with these statistics of overdose reporting is overdose is likely to be underreported. And there's also inconsistent record keeping. It's hard to tell whether or not an overdose is a suicide. It's hard to tell sometimes if an overdose occurred. If someone had an overdose and thankfully made it through it alive, what's the likelihood that they're going to go and tell a doctor that they were, a public service person, a counselor, that they almost died committing an illegal act? So the statistics are likely underreported. But one thing that we do know is with these reported statistics, overdose has become the #1 injury-related killer of Americans between the ages of 35 and 54. Now, perhaps if you think these people are a little bit older and wiser and should know how to handle themselves better, overdose is now the second leading cause of injury-related death for those between 15 and 34. What can be done about this problem? Well, I'm here to talk about Good Samaritan laws, but there's a couple other steps that can be done. One is this amazing medication called naloxone. It is to overdose what bare aspirin is to headaches. It is the wonder drug that works wonders. If someone is suffering an overdose and they are administered naloxone properly, they have a substantially increased chances of surviving that homicide. Several U.S. cities have implemented programs like this, Baltimore and Chicago most notably. They've seen reductions in their overdose rates as access to naloxone has increased. Another thing that can be done from a policy perspective is overdose prevention programs. These train the at-risk population in ways of how they can save each other's lives, whether it's through the naloxone administration, CPR, and it also makes them aware of the Good Samaritan laws. Good Samaritan laws offer immunity from prosecution, not arrest. Police often complain with drug policy reforms. They don't want a blurred line. Is marijuana going to be legal, but heroin's illegal? Well, I don't know how to arrest this. Good Sam laws take that out of the equation. It's protection from prosecution. Police are free to do their jobs the way that they've always done their jobs. Good Samaritan laws first started emerging in the U.S. and on college campuses back in the mid-1990s. On the college level, they are often referred to as medical amnesty programs. Slowly but steadily, the number has increased to about 100. Most recently, the University of Maryland passed one of these bills. We have two of the people who were very instrumental in this happening, Irene Alexander and Stacia Kostner, are both here. These policies on the campus level have a great deal of variation. Some of them are just alcohol protection. Some of them go beyond alcohol. Some of them also offer the protection from overdose from illegal drugs. Some of these also provide immunity from sanction for disorderly conduct. Disorderly conduct being about the only other thing that is nonviolent that someone who is drunk might be involved in, that the universities feel comfortable giving them immunity from protection. It seems like a pretty reasonable place to be in the middle. In 2006, there was a study conducted at Cornell University, and this has been the only real in-depth study on medical amnesty programs that's been conducted thus far. Before Cornell introduced a medical amnesty program in the fall of 2002, only 19% of students would even consider calling for help, and only 4% actually did call for help. Calling for help in this instance is a little nebulous because the study does not define calling for help as calling 911. It's possible they may have called a friend, it's possible they may have called a counselor that they trust, so these aren't necessarily 911 calls. But only 4% actually called for help in this situation, self-reported. The main reason people didn't call, there were two top reasons. They didn't want to get in trouble, and they didn't think the person who was suffering needed medical attention. Those two things speak to the problem here. We need immunity from protection, from getting in trouble, and on top of that, we need education. Something else that the Cornell Medical Amnesty Program did, and this is some of the brilliance of their program, was it got those who had had alcohol incidents into a psychoeducational intervention. Previously at Cornell, before the program, if you were involved in an alcohol overdose and the police came, helped you to the hospital, you were compelled, you were given it wasn't a court order, but it was a campus judicial order to attend the psychoeducational intervention. Only 22% went to these, and those were the 22% who went because of police assistance. After Cornell introduced this program, that number went up to 52%. So not only are we going to have more people likely to seek medical attention while they're in the midst of an overdose, while they are in the physical throes of death, they're also going to get the aftercare, the important things. If someone's got a problem, if someone nearly overdoses on alcohol, they may have an alcohol problem. And so there's some real benefit here that this is putting people into the treatment system, but not in a punitive way. And the increase was accomplished voluntarily. These people were not forced to go there. They weren't going to get kicked off campus. You had essentially a 150% increase in the number of people who went and got help after an overdose with alcohol. What sorts of protections did the Cornell program offer? It offered protection to the victim. It offered protection to the caller as long as they were operating in good faith. But it also placed an obligation on organizations hosting events. If a fraternity or school club was hosting an event and someone had too much to drink, a representative from that organization now has to call and make the phone call, or at least has to make a phone call. If not, it becomes an aggravated circumstance should greater sanctions come about. The takeaway from this, before I get to the takeaway, there's one thing about the Cornell study that if you're a drug policy reformer, you're very tempted to cite as a great fact, but I believe it's really a misinterpretation. The study said that the number of people who were afraid to call 911 fell by 50%. This gets misinterpreted frequently as twice as many people will call for help. I think it does reformers a disservice to sell this more than what it really is. Statistically, you can kind of maybe say it's not untruthful, but I don't think it's really accurate. I think the benefits of this program don't need to be oversold. The takeaway is these programs work. The call rates went up, and the quality of 911 intervention went up. More students entered into the psychoeducational intervention on a voluntary basis. These programs have inspired the states at some level. New Mexico became the first state in the country to pass Good Samaritan law in 2007. New Mexico has a comparable overdose rate to the district. Their overdose rate when they passed the law was 17.5 per 100,000, and the statistics you saw earlier from Ken, DC was always within one or two of those, usually, maybe a little higher, a little lower here and there. The national average is usually between 7 and 7.5 per 100,000. New Mexico passed their 911 Good Samaritan bill, SB 200, 2007, and this protection extends to both the victims and the helpers who call for help and act in good faith. It does not provide immunity to disorderly conduct. They took that out from some of these college models. However, it does include a provision that says if you help someone in an overdose situation, you may receive immunity from crimes other than possession. These Good Samaritan laws are limited to the arena of possession, but say you had a distribution level amount, like the gentleman from Washington State. It gives prosecutors, well, not the prosecutors, pardon me, it gives the judge some discretion. It legislatively instructs the judge that you are to use a Good Samaritan instance as a reason for reducing penalties even below the suggested mandatory, not mandatory, the suggested minimums. It's a little too soon to get really excited about what happened in New Mexico because the data is slowly trickling in. It's mostly anecdotal stories. When New Mexico passed the law in 2007, they also passed some other laws that helped people in overdose populations. They increased their access to treatment. This brought more people with addiction into the social service arena rather than the criminal justice arena. And the reporting from counselors is they've heard from many, many people in this population that they are more likely to call for help. They are aware of the program and they are willing to use it if they're in that situation. There's been some other states that have attempted to pass these laws, and one that actually managed to do it. I'm going to talk first about 2 states that didn't quite get it done, and then talk about Washington State, which did pass their law back in 2010. The first 2 states, California and New York, their laws are very, very similar to the New Mexico law. About the only difference is that they added paraphernalia to the session as protection. Both bills died. One can only speculate, and that's what I've done. There is, in New York, there was a very strong medical coalition that had formed and had signed on to this petition, but an action letter hoping to get the state legislator to pass this bill. It was all social justice organizations. It was all, other than some of the medical groups, it was all the usual suspects for drug policy reform. It wasn't exactly the broadest of coalitions, at least in terms of bringing in outside groups. That bill died in committee. In California, they got a little bit closer. It passed the House and it passed the Senate with some pretty strong numbers. But it too lacked the broad support that I feel is necessary. And Governor Schwarzenegger vetoed this law. He sent this explanation back to the California State Assembly. I am returning Assembly Bill 2460 without my signature. While I appreciate the author's intent behind the bill, I am troubled by that this bill essentially seeks to eliminate the penalty for an illegal act with an illegal substance. 2 days later, Governor Schwarzenegger decriminalized marijuana. So, a little bit of irony there. To be fair to Governor Schwarzenegger, he does make a distinction in his statement later on, saying that high-risk drug use and behavior is what he is concerned about. And if you know Governor Schwarzenegger, he's been, if not supportive, at least sympathetic to marijuana legalization over the years. And I don't want to rip him too hard on this, even though I think he went the wrong direction here. So, what did Washington State do so different that these other states just didn't manage to do? Washington State's law is remarkably comprehensive. It includes increased access to naloxone, but it also defines specific situations, both that would provide guidance for when a sentence should be below the suggested minimum, but it also provided more clarity as to what are aggravating circumstances, such as overdoses when there's children around, domestic violence, those sorts of things. So it was a really very holistic law. What I think was the missing ingredient that California and New York lacked was the coalition of support. Now in Washington, you had the Washington Department of Public Health, University of Washington Alcohol and Drug Abuse Institute, Washington Poison Center, the Science and Management of Addiction, and the ACLU of Washington. You're probably thinking, yeah, sure, that's all the other groups that probably were involved in the other states. But here's the difference. In Washington, they had the Attorney General of Washington on board. This is very key. When passing drug policy reform, I don't want to draw too many parallels to medical marijuana, but through this school I was fortunate enough to, through the legislation clinic, I was in the DC Council when the medical marijuana bill passed. And things were going really good with that law. It was looking much better than it turned out until the Attorney General voiced concerns. And then things started peeling back. The group in Washington State was very savvy for however they were able to get the Attorney General of Washington on board. I think that was the key difference. I think that's what got Washington the law that they have today, and it's really one of those things that, from a policy perspective, it shouldn't go ignored. What's the situation look like in DC? As we've talked about, the overdose rate here in the district is about 18 per 100,000, pretty similar to New Mexico. But DC has a different problem. Overdose Nationwide typically involves the drugs Ken was talking about. They are the prevailing drugs with overdose in this country. When you saw that increase from 1999 to 2005, that was when the prescription drugs really started to take over the overdose world. In the district, we have something a little bit different. Here, cocaine is the primary drug that causes overdose. Also, the typical overdose sufferer in the district is a little bit older. The majority of overdose deaths have occurred in the 51 to 60 range, as well as the 41 to 50 range. It attacks a slightly older population here. You can speculate as to why that is. My suspicion is a cocaine user who is that age, their heart just stops working at a certain point. But whatever the reason is, that's what we have here in the district. That does raise some cause for concern. These bills that have worked in these other states, the prescription medication, overdoses, they can be remedied by naloxone. But does that work on cocaine too? And the answer is yes, it does. There is good news for that. Naloxone is the wonder drug with overdoses. So in terms of recommendations, I believe there's really a demonstrated need for Good Samaritan laws across the country. The National Conference of Mayors agrees. In 2008, they passed a resolution strongly calling for the adoption of Good Samaritan amnesty laws. Components of a quality Good Samaritan law are protection for the user, protection for the caller, from possession, paraphernalia, and if you really want to be good, disorderly conduct. Placing obligations on organizations that hold events is something to consider, but that probably makes more sense on the college level. That sort of thing, it's probably more tricky when you get into the private world. In terms of passing these laws, the recommendation is to build broad-based coalition support. If you only have the medical community on your side, you may not have a friendly prosecutorial office, and your Attorney General may not be too kind to these laws. Something else that needs to be done is the accurate reporting of statistics, both by advocates and by the government. I don't think the government is trying to underplay the statistical foibles that exist with overdose, but government could better fund their social service agencies that keep track of these records, because right now they do not receive funding. Another recommendation, and this deals with treatment. This is somewhat outside the arena of overdose protection, but I think it's related. We need to stop sentencing marijuana offenders to treatment. This is not an argument based on freeing marijuana offenders. Rather, it's about the effectiveness of rehab. If you sentence someone to rehab, chances are it's not going to be very effective. Someone who goes to rehab through a sentencing they're not going there of their own will, and it's not very likely to stick. Furthermore, most people who are arrested for marijuana don't believe they have an addiction. Whether they do or not is largely irrelevant. And so what this is wasted treatment space. This space should be reserved for people who have problems with cocaine, heroin, and the prescription opioid medications, those sorts of things. If we have more treatment beds and spaces available, I believe that the problems with overdose will, in the long term, be remedied, because if we can funnel people into the social services network instead of the criminal justice network, and we can get them to want to go to treatment, then the treatment will actually work. And so it's a real, there's no direct connections, it's part of this whole greater fabric of the drug war. After all, war on drugs is about saving lives, so I would say the best strategy would be to declare peace, and that's the only way we will achieve victory. Thank you. Any questions?
Mike, we were talking a lot about this whole medical amnesty law. In aviation, which I have a lot more experience in, there's a unique kind of system for when someone screws the pooch very badly. You can call a phone number over at NASA and report an incident worthy of investigation, and NASA can take jurisdiction over it. And they write it up as a technical memo for how it got screwed up and how this very bad thing almost occurred or did occur. But if someone else calls the FAA before you call NASA, then the FAA shows up with guns and badges and takes your license. So there's this very big incentive of, well, if I call NASA, I get an embarrassing technical memo written about me. But I should do it fast, because if someone else saw what happened and they called the FAA, I could lose my license. And so it's a thing of, if there was nobody around when it occurred, and it was 2 o'clock in the morning and you were off controlled airspace, well, you could probably get away with whatever occurred. But if it was kind of, like 7 in the afternoon at a medium-sized airport, maybe I should call the number. And if it's at a bigger airport and you screw the pooch, well, you're dialing them before the parts are finished coming off your airplane. It's literally, you have to be in a race to rat yourself out to the nice cops before someone else rats you out to the bad cops. And it works very well. Yeah.
I asked you a question before, let me put you on the spot about it again. Okay, primarily when we have overdoses, it is respiratory failure. It happens while they're asleep and they die without waking up. Okay, they've taken too many opioids or methadone or whatever, and they start to snore, and that's their pulmonary system failing. People don't realize it, and then everybody goes to sleep. They wake up the next morning, the guy's dead. This happens a lot. We have what they call Skittles parties, where everybody comes to the party and they bring whatever pills are in their medicine cabinet, throw them into a bowl. Everybody just starts taking handfuls of pills and washing them down with booze, and this really does happen. But okay, having given the background, that's giving you for where do you think that the line should be drawn? Do you think the line should be drawn for people who may have brought it to the party? Do you think it should be drawn at, somebody dead the next morning when you called in? Should that still get the Good Samaritan exception where?
As when we had a conversation earlier, if someone is already dead and someone makes a Good Samaritan call, it's a real interesting question. The standard is usually in good faith. I would suppose that if you were aware of someone who was possibly still alive, then at that point you should still receive the protection. If it is plain and obvious that someone is dead and you're just calling to hopefully get some sort of protection because you have to call the coroner as well, well then, maybe there's some room for not throwing that to the protection basket. In terms of people who bring the pills to the party, I think that's pretty clearly distribution. I would say, though, when you said initially the way a lot of people die from overdose in southwestern Virginia, where they nod off and they go to sleep and they die in their sleep, I would say that probably the best thing for that would be increased public education to know the warning signs of overdose. And it's not just public education to the general public. This public education has to go to the affected populations. It's no good to train someone who's never going to be around in a drug. I won't say it's no good. It's of little benefit to train someone who is never going to be around a drug overdose, or likely never to be around a drug overdose, how to revive someone. On the other hand, if you are a frequent user or even an attendee of such an event, then yeah, and you're of the population that would really benefit from that. Gino?
My question is for Mr. Lammers. Have you tried in Wise County any sort of like more comprehensive treatment approaches or have you supported for like a community-based response to the problem you have to say
Well, I mean, we've tried various things, and the Suboxone problem, by pointing out buprenorphine and Suboxone Subutex, came out of attempts to find a way that we could get something that would keep people from withdrawing from opioids, pain pills, and keep their cravings from happening. And like I said, of course, then people started using that and found out ways to abuse it. We're trying to get a drug court going in our county. Those are always kind of touchy issues. There's a fair number of people who don't believe in them. Because while I think drug courts work well, they look goofy as all get out. And you're from somebody on the outside watching. So it's hard to convince some people to get behind that. The problem, of course, is like I said earlier. A lot of times, by the time there has to be something where the community is affected before it gets to us to really make a serious change. It's all well and good to point at the prosecutor and law enforcement and say they're the problem and they may be part of it, but the reality is that most of the time, by the time they get to me, I'd say 80% of them, I'm not really going to make a dent on. They're already lost. And I hate to say that, but then, and this is always going to be an excuse you're going to hear from a reason you're going to hear from every prosecutor is after it's the point where I can't help the person. Well, my first duty is to protect the people of the county and, help that person who's being charged if I can. If I can't help that person, I'm going to protect the people of the county. And the only tool I have for that is jail and prison. And to get a treatment program in Virginia's prisons, there's a three-year-long treatment program in the prisons, okay? You can get NA and AA and that sort of thing in different jails, but I mean, actual treatment program, there's a 3-year treatment program at the Department of Corrections. Somebody has to be sentenced to longer than 3 years. And I'm here to tell you, I think you have to get caught, I don't know how many times you have to get caught before you actually get sentenced that's over 3 years in Virginia, So that's not really something that, you don't walk up to many people and go, well, I can give you a year in jail, or we can give you 3.5 years so you got time to in-process and get into this treatment program. They aren't going to take that. The primary concern of most defendants is not going to jail or getting out as quick as they can. So it's that's the situation we're in.
Right.
I was wondering here, in terms of the issue that the case that you described that was reversed and then sent back down, this seemed to me to be a Fourth Amendment privacy argument. Is that correct in terms of constitutionality?
Right, it was decided on the Fourth Amendment issue.
So, has there been any interest in kind of equal protection argument under, let's say, Title VI of the Rights Act, for those kinds of programs that mandate that type of Title 16 legal. Anybody that receives federally assisted funds can't discriminate on the basis of race. Given the fact that there's a disproportionate number of minorities that are in those public housing and public assistance programs, let's say, is there an argument there, equal protection argument under Civil Rights Title VI that might be argued to prevent this kind of city's demand?
I know that particular case that I cited, it was only a Fourth Amendment, was decided on the Fourth Amendment argument, and it sort of scared a lot of it off. There hasn't been a lot of child programs like that, but there are some now that are starting to come back up, as I pointed out, the food stamp program, unemployment, and as I noticed, like not right before I came here and continuing research on the paper, is on tribal lands and housing. It appears to be very prevalent. In fact, it appears to be mandatory in a lot of complexes if you want to receive it. So I think it's still a developing area. I think it had that case, and then it sort of died out because nobody wanted to. They lost. So they didn't. It was sort of a block there, a legal block. But I think it's probably going to come back up now that you had this political shift, and there's more willingness to make these, to go after individuals, not only in housing, but also welfare, food stamps, unemployment, all the benefit programs. If you want to receive it, you have to get drug tested, but it's still mostly Fourth Amendment argument.
Any consideration that DNA testing might be next?
It's a good question. I'm not sure about that, but it could. Anything's possible, I guess, right? I mean, think of the one in, there was one in Kentucky that was very severe. Texas, I think, tried to do a trial program, things like that. So anything's possible. Who knows? That's what I was saying before, and my last comments were, probably at some point you have to start challenging some of these proposals.
I just wanted to mention too that Maryland's Good Samaritan law passed, except it was 3 pages long and they scratched out every single part of it except for the last line, which says that it can be used, the fact that you called for help during a drug overdose can be used as a mitigating factor, whatever that means, whenever that means. But we had a coalition lined up. We had Judge Burnett who spoke, testified. I testified. I read a bunch of stories from students. We had Dr. Reardon come in, whose son overdosed on our campus. But then 2 members of law enforcement came up and testified, and everything was scratched out. So I guess if I do want to make a question out of this, how do we get law enforcement on our side?
I don't know how we can get law enforcement on our side, but beyond the Washington State's Attorney's Office, they also had the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs on board. Their executive director, Don Pierce, his line on the Washington law was, what it came down to us is that if it can save a few lives, it's worth it. So perhaps that's the message that can bring in law enforcement and our less friendly forces. Any other questions? Thank you very much.